Hello! This is Rung Divisions by Fancyyyyy Synthesis. It's one of the most inspiring modules I've used recently, but it's also quite a hard one to sum up in one sentence. It has two main components. The first is a clock divider, which outputs pulses that you can combine in two buses to create polyrhythmic patterns. That also drives a universal shift register, which outputs pseudo-random, chaotic or looping stepped voltage patterns. Now that part might make you think of the Turing machine, and Rung Divisions can certainly cover that sort of ground, but it's actually an expanded take on something that's a bit of a cult classic in hardcore synth circles, Rob Hordijk's Rungler circuit, which is at the heart of the Benjolin synth. And there are dozens of interesting musical applications for it. For example, I've been using it as a trigger sequencer for drum sounds, and as a source of rhythmic gates fed into a DAC to produce a melody. You can patch it as a kind of voltage-controlled clock divider to advance a sequencer. The shift register can produce random or looping melodies that change direction. You can use the complementary outputs to drive two voices at once. At audio rates, it can be a VCO that generates its own stepped waveforms. And with some Rungler-style feedback patching, it can do chaotic generative sequencing. So if that's got your attention, then strap yourself in and I'll give you a guided tour of the module before taking you through all of those patches in detail. Just before I get into it, I should point out that Fancyyyyy Synthesis sent me this unit to check out, but I don't get any other sort of payment. This is a demo, not a review, and this channel is a hobby, not a job, so I only showcase things that I'm genuinely enthused about. And I really am enthused about this one. For me, Rung Divisions is a prime example of what's so great about modular synthesis. It has no obvious equivalent in fixed architecture synths, and there are no preconceived notions about how you should use it. But with a bit of experimentation, it can bring something unique and borderline magical to your patches. Anyway, let's start with a quick look at the controls. So, as I mentioned already, Rung Divisions has two main sections, a clock divider and a shift register. It won't do anything without a clock, and that comes in here at the bottom left. You can use just about anything as a clock. It'll turn any signal crossing 1 volt into a pulse, and it can run at up to 40 kHz. The divider counts the incoming pulses, and these individual outputs spit out 1 pulse for every 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 and 8 pulses received at the input. A gate here will reset the counters. It's worth pointing out that these outputs produce pulses that always have the same width as the input clock. So unlike other clock dividers where the outputs fill 50% of their period and you essentially get square waves out, here the pulses become relatively thinner and sparser as you go down the divisions. This is pretty key to how Rung Divisions works when you start combining clock divisions. Speaking of which, you might have noticed this column of 3-position switches. These allow you to route each division to one of 2 buses where they're combined using OR logic to produce more complex patterns which are available at these 2 outputs at the top. I'll get into this in a bit more detail in the first patch. Bus 1 is also internally routed to clock the shift register, which is the other main component of Rung Divisions. If you're familiar with the Turing machine, you'll get the basic idea here, but one difference is that this is a universal shift register, which means it can shift its data to the left or the right. Let me just patch in a slow clock to show you how it works. The register consists of 8 bits which can either be on or off as indicated by these 8 LEDs. Every time the register receives a clock, it shifts the state of all the bits 1 place to the right. You can change the state of the first bit manually by using this momentary switch. You can also change the state of the first bit via the data input and the chance control, which determines how likely it is for this to have an effect. When it's fully clockwise, the loop is locked and it will ignore the data input, but you can gradually decrease it to increase the likelihood of the first bit being changed. It uses XOR logic, so if the current bit and the data input signal are both high or both low, it won't change. It only changes from one state to the other if their states are different. Here I've patched the built-in noise generator to the data input to get random changes, but you could use an oscillator, an LFO or a slower gate pattern, whatever you like. Depending on what you use and its relationship to the clock signal, you can make predictable or more random changes to the pattern. The chance control lets you lock it if you want to stop things changing. You can change the shift direction with a press of this button or a gate at this input, so it'll start shifting the bits to the left rather than the right, and you can set the loop length using this knob and CV input. If you set it to 16, it'll basically play through the 8 states twice, but the second time the states will be inverted. There are 3 outputs from the shift register. The 1-bit output is a gate which reflects the state of the first bit. The 3-bit and 8-bit outputs are stepped analog voltages made using digital to analog converters. Basically, each bit corresponds to a set voltage, and these are summed according to which bits are high. Their values update on every step based on the state of the bits in the register, so you get a stepped voltage out which you could run through a quantizer and use for a pitch sequence, for example. I'll get into that in more detail in the individual patches. Anyway, that's enough theory for now. Let's start using it to make some music. So to show off everything that Rung Divisions can do, I've put it into this little case which I've based around a couple of analog voices. There's the New Systems Instruments harmonic shift oscillator and the Danny Sound EN129, plus a bunch of other modulation and utilities that I'll explain as I use them. I've also got the palette case set up here in front, which I'm mainly going to be using for Master Clock from Pamela's Pro Workout. I'll use it for some multing and some basic mixing and maybe some effects later from the ALM MFX as well. Also for this first patch, I've got this sidecar set up with some drum modules, because the first thing I want to explore is using the clock divider as a drum sequencer. So let's get started. I've got 120 BPM times 4 clock here from PAMS, which I'm just going to feed into the clock input. So this is our kind of 16th note clock. And let's take the snare drum, just an 808 drum module here. Let's go into the bus 1 output, and then we can explore using these switches to assign different clock divisions to that. So the clock itself, the master clock coming in, 16th note there, and by flicking these switches we can put different combinations. That's the divide by 3 against the divide by 4 there. Or 3 and 5. Let's go for something relatively sparse to start us off. Let's go for 6 and 7. And let's patch in the kick drum straight into the divide by 4 just to give us a 4 on the floor kind of metronome. And let's patch in a clap on the divide by 8 just to give us that classic rhythm. And so by playing with these snare clocks we can make that pattern more or less complex. Let's go for a kind of maraca shaker on bus 2 and use a different combination of divisions for that. So by flicking the switch the other way, let's go for like 2, 3 and 5. Now bus 1 is also driving the shift register, which has got nothing in it at the moment, but I can take the 1-bit output from that and use that to trigger a rim shot. And let's just manually add a couple of steps in there. We've got some rims as well. So yeah, by flicking with these switches, it's quite performable. You can flick the main clock into the snare, say, to get little fills. And we can also get more interesting if we use the reset input, and maybe let's take this kick drum into the divide by 3, move the clap into the divide 5, say, and we've now got a much more strange polyrhythmic pattern. If we take the divide by 8 and go into the reset, we've now got a 2-beat pattern that's quite interesting. What about if we were to randomly skip some of those reset gates? So let's go into the Olivia Arts Uncertainty over here, which is a kind of random gate skipper. And these outputs progressively skip more and more of the gate. So let's go into the reset. So at the top it's mostly going to re-trigger it, or reset it rather. And if we go down, we get these nice kind of patterns which sometimes loop and sometimes go on a bit longer and get a bit more complex. Yeah, in combination with maybe another clock divider or some different outputs from PAMS, just these 5 drum sounds, you can get some very nice, complex, evolving rhythms going on. Okay, for this next patch, I'm going to continue the theme of using the clock divider outputs and the clock divider buses, but rather than using them to trigger individual things, I'm going to merge them and use them to generate a pitch sequence for an oscillator. To do that, I'm going to use this DAC module from Beers, a little Australian maker, and the way this works is when it gets a gate or you turn one of these switches on, it adds a voltage equivalent to the corresponding number of semitones, and it will either transpose an input signal if you feed a sequence into it, or with nothing connected to the input, it will just generate these as offset voltages and it'll add them together. So by feeding gates into these various different intervals, you can generate a musical sequence. Let me show you what I mean. I've got bus 1 with divisions 3 and 7 sent to it, and that is going into the +7, which is like a perfect fifth in the DAC. Bus 2 has got gates divisions 4 and 5, and that's going to the +2, or a single tone transpose there. And then I've got the 1-bit output as well. I've got the shift register looping with 4 bits active in it. That's going to be clocked by bus 1, so that'll kind of advance through on a divide 3 and a divide 7 combination. And I'm going to use that to, that's going to the +5 transpose input. And the volt per octave then sequence that this is generating is going into the harmonic shift oscillator from New Systems Instruments. That's running into the Danny Sound MMVCA, through Sarajevo from Chaos Devices for a bit of delay, also through MFX off screen for a bit of reverb. I've got the delay dry at the moment, and the envelope generator for the VCA is New Systems Inertia. And I'm just skipping some of the gates from my master clock using the Olivia Arts Uncertainty module, which is a gate skipper. So we're not going to get every single pulse. Let's just get it started. I'm using PAMS Pro as the clock off screen here, just feeding in a 16th note. And you can hear these patterns of gates are kind of turning on these transposition intervals in the DAC. And we're getting this nice melodic sequence. Let's add a little bit of delay. And it's quite complex because of this 1-bit output as well from the shift register, which is being clocked quite irregularly. Let's get it a little more interesting. Let's add a slow second kind of voltage from PAMS to the +12, so that's going to shift it up an octave. I've got this on a divide 16 off screen from PAMS, so we're going to get 2 bars off and then 2 bars on. And we can also use the individual clock division outputs from Rung Divisions to do some other stuff in the patch. Let's take the divide by 8 output. And I'm just going to mix that with the envelope signal to give us some little accents, just a little smidge of that being mixed in the Chaos Samara. And I'm multing this output to the harmonic level on the oscillator and to the VCA. So that's quite subtle, but it means that every 8 steps we'll get a little accent. Let's take the divide by 7 and go into the harmonic stride input on harmonic shift oscillator, which will just change the spectrum every 7 notes. You get these little metallic bursts, which are quite nice. And then let's take the divide by 6 and the divide by 5 and modulate the attack and decay time of the envelope. So we're getting little gates coming out of here, which are going to slow down the attack and decay time a bit on the envelope. So this is really the heart of this patch. It's creating the rhythm of the note changes in the sequence, and all these little bits of timed modulation that are all in sync. Okay, next I want to look at using the shift register as a kind of pitch sequencer, and I'm going to start in the kind of classic Turing machine mold. I've got the 8-bit output, running it through the scope. I'm running it through Gliss here to scale and offset it. It's one of the really handy features in the Bella Gliss module. You can just use the touch screen to bring the voltage into a usable range. That's running through a quantizer, and I've patched up a simple kind of sawtooth voice up here. At the moment, the register is locked. I've got the chants fully clockwise, and if I feed in a clock, it'll just start playing this in an 8-step loop. And the data input is connected to the internal noise source. I've kind of self-patched it. So So if I start to decrease the chance, this means that the closer clockwise I go, the more chances that one of these bits will flip and change the sequence. And this is the kind of classic Turing machine technique where you can, with the chance set to minimum, it will always be looking at what's at that data input, which is always noise, which is always random, so you'll get this kind of constantly evolving. If you find something you like, you can lock it. Now what's interesting with Rung Divisions compared to the Turing machine is that you can reverse the direction. So if I hit direction, and you can self-patch that direction change, of course. Let's take the divide by 8 clock. So now we've got a slightly longer pattern, twice as long in fact. You can also set the length to 16, which will play it through one way and then play it through again with the bits inverted. And of course you could make it 7 steps with a divide by 8 direction change. So these locked patterns can get quite complex quite quickly with a bit of self-patching. And of course if you just introduce a bit of chance. And if the trigger on every note is a bit repetitive, you could maybe take the voice to be triggered from the 1-bit output. So now whenever the first bit is high, you'll get an envelope, so you get slightly more rhythmically interesting patterns. Or you could set it to bus 2 and route maybe a combination of 3, 5 and 7. But you can also get some more interesting results and slightly more repeatable patterns out of Rung Divisions if you use a data input that's kind of related to the clock input, rather than using noise, so you're just getting random flipping of the bit. If you do something where the bit changes are kind of synced in some way to the clock. So what I've got now is a ×2 clock on PAMS Pro workout on the first channel, which is the main clock, and I've got a divide by 2 on the second channel. And what that means is that for every 4 ticks of the main clock, this will be sending a high signal for 2 of them and then a low signal. And that will basically, with the buffer empty, that'll start off by giving us 2 bits on, 2 bits off, 2 bits on, 2 bits off. And then when it runs around again, because of the XOR logic, it will reverse that. Let's show you what I mean. The buffer is empty, and if I press start, we're getting on, off, and then it's clearing itself effectively by, because it's an XOR, so when they're both high on the second repeat. And this gets a lot more interesting if we were to switch this to a divide by 3, say, on PAMS. In fact, let's just start it from clear so you can see what happens when the 3 bits go high, 3 bits go low, and then by the time the third one of that second run of 3 comes around, it's come round to the next loop of the 8 steps. So you get this pattern that does it repeats itself eventually, but in a much more roundabout way of getting there. And of course you could explore all sorts of combinations of divisions. And again, I think if you maybe go into the 1-bit, we get a much sparser pattern. Let's increase the decay time a bit here, filter it down a bit. With that delay from Sarajevo as well. We get this lovely long pattern, and all that we're feeding in is a ×2 and a divide by 3. And of course you could maybe do a divide 7 direction change. can see, it opens up a whole world of semi-generative pseudo-random sequencing. So for this patch, I've taken that Turing machine style sequencer idea a step further, and I'm going to use the 3-bit and the 8-bit outputs from Rung Divisions to sequence 2 different voices at the same time with the contents of the shift register. So the 3-bit output, first of all, is running through the microscope, into the Samara for offset and attenuation, and then into the disting to be quantized, where it's going to feed the volt per octave of the harmonic shift oscillator, which is running through optimic. So our first voice is pretty simple and sounds like this, with what's in the buffer at the moment locked on an 8-step loop. I've got the quantizer set to pentatonic minor just to keep things relatively harmonious between the 2 voices. So that's a fairly simple kind of bass line. The 8-bit output is running through Gliss again for offset and attenuation so I can scale it into the right range. Then it's also running through the DAC so I can transpose it manually if I want to by adding 7 semitones or 12 semitones. That's also running through the other side of the disting dual quantizer and then into the volt per octave on the EN129, which is running through the other Danny Sound modules, the filter and the VCA. And that's controlled by the Danny Sound ADSR envelope. And that's being triggered not on every 16th note, but by bus 2 of Rung Divisions, which I've set to a divide by 2, 3, 5, and 7 all combined. So we get a slightly more syncopated pattern. Even though the basic underlying loop is only 8 steps long, we've got a more complicated trigger pattern, which makes it a bit more interesting. That voice sounds like this. It's a pulse wave. And that trigger pattern means we're getting a couple of little slides underneath, gives it a slightly more acidy feel. So let's try layering these. Let's start off with the harmonic shift oscillator voice, and I'm going to bring in a kick drum underneath it as well. And let's fade in the other voice. So they interplay together really well. I can use the DAC to bring that second voice into a higher range. And if we bring down the chance control, we can start to introduce the chance that one of these bits will randomly flip and change up the pattern a bit. So it's always pot luck as to what you're going to get here, but let's see. The noise feeding the data input just for randomness. Just bring it down really slowly because I don't want to. There we go, let's lock that again. And then let's. So it's a nice way to kind of like let a little bit of randomness in and then relock it. Okay, for this next patch I want to explore using the shift register as a kind of voltage controlled clock divider to produce a clock that's going to advance a melodic sequence. I've basically got 1 bit in the shift register. I've got set it to 8 steps long, and if I feed in a 16th note clock into the clock input, which I've just routed to bus 1 via the little switch, this is going to get the shift register cycling, and this 1 bit is going to pass that first position every 8 steps, which is going to advance the sequencer, which is also going to open fire the envelope, which is opening the LPG, and the harmonic shift oscillator here is providing the voice. This little melody sequence is just running through the disting quantizer. So it's just 5 steps, and at the moment that's advancing every 8 clocks. But if I reduce the length of the shift register pattern down to 5, 4, 3 and so on, you can hear I'm getting these different divisions effectively. They're always going to be on grid. Let's leave it on 5. Now the other, I'm taking a copy of that 1-bit output, and I'm using that to trigger the R&D step sample and hold, which is sampling a slow-moving LFO from Oct. So that's going to give me, every time that bit passes 1, it's going to give me a new, not really a random value, it'll be a value from that LFO, so it will kind of cycle round. But let's modulate the length. If this goes in here, now with every time the shift register hits that first bit, it's going to sample a new value and adjust this length. You'll see those LEDs spinning around, which gives us a kind of pseudo-random tempo effectively for this sequencer. But it's always going to fall on the grid because it's being driven by this 16th note clock. Let's just fire in some drums alongside this so you can hear how it sounds. You can play with the LFO speed to influence this pattern. You'll see it's kind of sweeping from low to high and then back down again. And we can do one other cool thing. Let's take the 3-bit output, which is going to give us another kind of complementary stepped output from the shift register. I'm just going to feed that into the scope so you can see what that step pattern looks like. And let's take that into the harmonic stride parameter on the oscillator. I'm also taking a unipolar CV from the sample and hold to control the decay time of the envelope as well, just to give a little bit of extra variation. And now we've got this much more kind of atonal, slightly percussive sort of sound. And it's crying out for a bit of spring reverb, this patch, so let's... I'm running these through the MFX Slinky Reverb algorithm, and I'm controlling the length and the damping with the joystick. To be honest, that's what I really love about this patch, is this kind of springy metallic vibes you can get. So there's another whole dimension to Rung Divisions, which is using it at audio rate. In this patch, I'm going to use the harmonic shift oscillator's sine wave output as the clock, and I'm going to use the shift register locked to create some kind of stepped waves. At the moment, it sounds like this. And if I adjust the frequency of the HSO, see it kind of tracks in with that. So it's kind of like a sub-oscillator, basically. I've got the noise going to the data input, and if I bring the chance down, it'll start to get progressively noisier and more glitchy. And you can lock it again, and you can basically twist it left to pick a new wave and relock. You can also adjust the length of the shift register, so go up to 16, it'll go down an octave. As you get shorter and shorter, and again you can start glitching these up as well. They'll be pretty simple at the lower lengths, but 8 steps gives you quite a long wave to play with. Let's fire in a little pitch sequence. And use an envelope and a VCA to kind of tame this a bit. So you can get this kind of nice digital distortion kind of weirdness. But another thing I quite like doing is using one step of this little sequence from step 8, the gate that's coming out of the final step. Let's go to the length CV. And this will effectively randomize the wave for us in each rotation of the loop. Down slightly. So we've got this kind of complex pulse wave that's changing itself with every repetition of the pattern, which is quite nice. And we can mix the sine wave from our source oscillator in as well. So to finish, I want to look at using the 3-bit output for some classic Rungler style chaos in a kind of generative sequencer patch. The way I've got things set up at the moment, I've got Oct acting as the clock and the data input for Rung Divisions. I've got an 8-step shift register pattern looping, and the 8-bit output of that is being routed through Gliss, again just to scale and offset it, through the disting quantizer and into the volt per octave of the EN129. The pulse wave from that is running through Optimix, and there's an envelope from Inertia which is opening Optimix up. And with the pattern looping and the clock steady with no modulation at all on the timings, we just have a fairly straightforward 8-step pattern. And the 3-bit output I've got fed through the scope into the FM input of Oct. So if I start to add just a tiny bit of FM there, it'll start to affect the timing. And if I now introduce the chance of some of those bits flipping, we now get things getting much more complicated pretty quickly. So we're going to get a few of these bits flipping, which means both the timing and the note pattern is going to change. I've got a mult of that 3-bit which I'm going to use to control the decay time of the envelope, or to modulate the decay time of the envelope. And this means when the sequence slows down, the envelope will get a bit longer and those notes will sustain, which will sort of fill in some of the gaps. And it'll sometimes get stuck in certain states, that's the kind of nature of chaos. And it'll try and find some kind of equilibrium. Let's give it some reverb. We're now basically in the position where we could just let this play away. You'd get this kind of pseudo-random complex pattern of variations. Let's just add a little bit more of that 3-bit FM. It'll start to swing a bit more extremely from slow to high tempo. You might need to nudge it out occasionally. Let's just take another slower LFO from Oct and go into the PWM. So I'm going to leave it there for now. Hopefully these patches have given you a taste of what Rung Divisions is capable of. There's a fair bit of ground I didn't cover, particularly around audio rate use and Benjolin style chaos patches, so there's a good chance it will make another appearance on the channel before too long. If you've enjoyed the video, do leave a comment and a thumbs up, share with your friends and hit subscribe if you haven't already. I'll catch you again soon, and thanks for watching.